Chapter 15, The Greatness of the Good News, page 524. I am astonished at the promptness with which you have turned away from the one who called you and have decided to follow a different version of the good news. Galatians, chapter 1 verse 6, Jerusalem Bible. It is in the good news set forth in the scriptures that Christian freedom finds its base. The very proclamation of that good news is a call to freedom. It would not be good news if it led anywhere else. Because of where it leads, it is a glorious good news, one that from its inception was a good news of great joy, and no finer service can be performed for people than to share that good news with them. The footnote reads, 2 Corinthians, chapter 4 verse 4, Luke, chapter 2 verse 10. End of footnote. It can bring them in far greater measure of freedom from fear, guilt, and anxiety, replacing these with a growing confidence, hope and peace of mind and heart. To do this, however, that good news cannot be presented in an adulterated, humanly manipulated, form. There is no question that Jehovah's Witnesses believe that they are part of an urgent effort to make the good news known worldwide. They believe that people's very lives depend on both hearing and accepting the message they bring. While the depth of this belief, and the motivation it produces, may and do vary from witness to witness, still it must at least be admitted that even as a whole witnesses are more than mere churchgoers or passive listeners. For most witnesses, one of the strongest proofs that the Watchtower organization is indeed the sole entity that God has approved as his instrument is the belief that this is the only organization on earth that is making known the good news of the kingdom and accomplishing the foretold witness to all the nations that is to precede the final end. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 24 verse 14. End of footnote. For some 6 decades the Watchtower's teaching has been that the parable of the sheep and goats, and the dividing of people of all the nations into 2 classes, with individuals' eternal destiny hanging in the balance, was being accomplished by the door-to-door work of Jehovah's Witnesses as they distributed the Watchtower's literature and, to a greater or lesser degree, made return calls. While now acknowledging that the actual division and judgment of the sheep and the goats is yet future, that preaching work is still viewed as playing a vital role in the outcome for all persons. The footnote reads, see the Watchtower of October 15, 1995, pages 18 to 28, see also Crisis of Conscience, chapter 10, which relates the change in the major teaching regarding the 1914 generation, which doubtless prompted the accompanying shift in teaching regarding the division of the sheep and the goats. End of footnote. In exhorting witnesses to door-to-door activity, the organization frequently has made use of Jehovah's instructions to the visionary man with the writer's inkhorn in chapter 9 of Ezekiel's prophecy, arguing that the only way that this symbolic person could have accomplished his mission to put a mark on the forehead of those who would escape the coming destruction would have been by going to everyone, mainly by reaching them in their homes. The footnote reads, Ezekiel, chapter 9 verse 1 to 11, see the Watchtower of March 1, 1985, page 14. End of footnote. Here, too, the claim has been that Jehovah's Witnesses, and only Jehovah's Witnesses, were accomplishing this marking work worldwide. The 8,600 or so anointed among them were the modern-day watchman class, and it was flatly stated that, of course, those refusing to listen to Jehovah's Watchmen have no hope of survival. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, September 15, 1988, pages 14, 15. End of footnote. Those who accept their message receive the life-saving mark in their forehead or seat of intelligence. Witnesses are told that failure to share in that work can make them blood guilty as regards those who die. All this witnessing, marking, dividing work, of life or death consequence, was to be fully accomplished during the lifetime of the generation already in existence in 1914. Witnesses received a constant flow of reports of numerical growth in various countries as evidence that this was all true, that their organization was, by itself and apart from all other religions, accomplishing this crucial global task. How valid have been these claims, and to what extent has the proclaimed goal been realized? How global is the worldwide witness? From a small beginning in the United States in the late 1870s, Jehovah's Witnesses today are active in 212 countries and islands. The millions of hours spent annually in witnessing and the hundreds of millions of publications distributed in scores of languages are all clear fact. Had the Watchtower organization been content to say that it has accomplished a noteworthy international proclamation of its own message, there would be no reason whatsoever to disagree. But it went far beyond that by claiming that through it as an instrument, and through it alone, God is making the good news known to all mankind, fulfilling in this way the vision of the angel who has everlasting good news to declare as glad tidings to those who dwell on the earth, and to every nation and tribe and tongue and people. The footnote reads, Revelation, chapter 14 verse 6. End of footnote. An example of the organization's own self-image is found in the March 1, 1985, Watchtower, in an article titled Shedding Forth Light Amidst Earth's Gloom, dealing with chapter 60 of Isaiah's prophecy. In discussing verses 8 to 11 of this prophecy, it applies the shedding forth of light as coming particularly from 1919 onward, mentions the diminishing number of anointed witnesses, and then says, pages 16, 20, this aging group grows smaller, as one by one they finish their earthly course in integrity. About 9,000 now remain. But others, numbering into the millions, are flocking like doves to their birdhouse holes, or dovecots, finding refuge in God's organization. Isaiah, chapter 60 verse 8, the New World Translation, the New English Bible, they are like the flocks of doves seen in Palestine at certain seasons, flying just like a cloud, so numerous that they actually darken the sky. Next, Jehovah addresses his organization, saying, any nation and any kingdom that will not serve you will perish, and the nations themselves will without fail come to devastation. Isaiah, chapter 60 verse 12, all prideful worldly nations and other opposers will be humbled at Armageddon. Jehovah declares, I will rock all nations, and the desirable things of all the nations must come in, and I will fill this house with glory. Haggai, chapter 2 verse 7, but persecutors, apostates, and other disrespectful opposers will be compelled to bow down, acknowledging in chagrin that Jehovah's Witnesses do indeed represent God's organization, the city of Jehovah, Zion of the Holy One of Israel. Isaiah, chapter 60 verse 12 to 14. A following article titled Jehovah Speeds It Up then lists examples of notable numerical expansion in various countries, and in its conclusion says on page 22. We rejoice that in recent years, Jehovah has so wonderfully cared for the expanding of the Watchtower branch facilities. Today, these branches are equipped to help massive flocks of doves. Therefore, let all of us share in beaming forth the light of the kingdom good news to millions more. Let us point all homing doves to the way of salvation behind the protective walls of Jehovah's organization and increase praise to him at its gates. Jehovah's Witnesses have indeed enjoyed notable growth in many countries of the world, some areas producing a much greater and more rapid increase than others. As seen, great stress is laid on such expansion as convincing evidence of divine blessing. But is a religion's numerical growth ever a safe guide or indicator as to its being specially chosen by God? It is never pointed out that other religions, such as the Seventh-day Adventists and the Mormons, religions that, like the Watchtower organization, had their birth in the United States during the 19th century, have registered approximately the same rate of growth as that of Jehovah's Witnesses. The footnote reads, for example, in 1961 Jehovah's Witnesses reported 900,000 members, the Adventists 1,200,000 members. In 1984, Jehovah's Witnesses had increased to 2,800,000, the Adventists to 4 million. Mormons have gone in about the same proportion during the same period. A few years ago the Mormon Church, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, reported a membership of 6.2 million, of whom 2.2 million were located in about 115 lands outside the United States. The standards for determining membership certainly vary. Witnesses list only those who report time in field service, while the other religions refer to include a broader scope, but whatever the standard, the fact remains that the rate of growth or percentage of numerical increase is approximately the same. End of footnote. Obviously, if numerical growth were the criterion for determining God's approval and blessing, then the enormous worldwide growth of the Roman Catholic faith over a period of centuries, particularly from the 4th century forward, should be proof positive of its having enjoyed divine blessing. The standard used in validating its own claims is not, however, applied by the Watchtower organization to other religions. The footnote reads, one might consider as just one modern example the religion called the Church of Jesus Christ, begun in the 1920s by Simon Kimbangu in the African country of Zaire. Toward the close of the last century its members numbered nearly 7 million in several counties. End of footnote. If the goal were to achieve international status and membership, that goal has been attained. But if the goal was to reach all mankind with the Watchtower's message before destruction arrived, in the few years said to remain before Armageddon, then the results achieved fall very, very far short. One need but consider that the population of China, now surpassing 1 billion persons, represents 1/5 of the total world population, and there are but a relative handful of Jehovah's Witnesses among that enormous population. There are about 25,000 witnesses in India, but with its population of over 1 billion persons that still means just one witness to about 43,000 persons. While the number of witnesses in India is growing, at a rate of 3% in recent years, the population of India is also growing, at a rate of about 26 million people a year. Currently the average time spent in field service by each witness in India comes to about 1 hour per day. The footnote reads, this average is drawn from the combined hour of full-time pioneers and of congregation publishers. End of footnote. At that rate, even if divine judgment could be based on only 20 minutes of witnessing to an individual, the witnesses still could reach only a little over 1% of the people in a year. But India's population annual growth rate is 3%. And a large part of the hours spent witnessing involve talking to the same persons on return visits and home Bible studies, or simply in going back over territories covered previously. If all factors continued as now, the annual growth rate of India's population, the annual 3% increase of witnesses, and if 80% of all hours spent were devoted strictly to contacting persons not witnessed to before, by the year 2014 the witnesses would have reached only about half of India's population with such 20 minutes of a life or death judgment testimony. Moreover, that long period of opportunity simply does not fit the scenario the organization sets out, for witnesses are regularly told that we stand at the brink of the Great Tribulation. The footnote reads, as in the Watchtower of March 1, 1985, page 21. End of footnote. The ratio in Pakistan with its 141 million inhabitants is even more disproportionate, 192,000 persons for each witness. The combined populations of China, India, and Pakistan represent 2/5 of the world population, 2 out of every 5 persons living on Earth. And only a tiny fraction of this enormous population has even the slightest acquaintance with the Watchtower message. It would seem to be sheer egotism for any organization to believe that a righteous and loving God could base a life or death judgment of all humanity on such a terribly misbalanced and fragile basis. The footnote reads, figures cited in these paragraphs are drawn from the chart in the January 1 issues of the Watchtower, 2004. End of footnote. To all this one may add about 635 million more persons found in the predominantly Muslim countries of Arabia, North and West Africa, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Afghanistan and Turkey, where again only a minute fraction of the population has been contacted. I recall that when visiting Morocco on a zone overseer trip in 1978, the Watchtower missionaries there informed me that the Brooklyn headquarters had strictly instructed that they should not attempt to witness to Muslims but should restrict their witnessing solely to the small, predominantly Christian, European population found in that country. The footnote reads, this rule was so that they might avoid expulsion from the country as being guilty of proselytizing. End of footnote. Factually, Jehovah's Witnesses today are contacting at best about 1/2 of Earth's population to any extent worthy of mention. In certain countries the coverage is intensive, and in the Western Hemisphere, Europe, and some other lands, witnesses visit homes in some areas with a frequency that can be as often as every few weeks. Yet even in such countries, including the United States, in which the Watchtower organization had its birth, the fact is that what is said at the doors is short, usually quite routine, and almost always centers around the offer of certain literature. The great majority of people have only a vague idea as to what the organization teaches, what its message is about. One need but ask persons at random in such countries what they know of Jehovah's Witnesses to find that, though they may view witnesses as basically good people, for a large percentage the only thing they know of the witness religion is that they take literature from door to door, are at odds with other religions, and perhaps that they do not accept blood transfusions, or do not vote, or similar negative positions. Because of a basic good-heartedness, many witnesses feel disturbed at the thought that the destiny of either eternal life or of everlasting destruction is supposedly going to be decided through Earth's population's response to their organization's public proclamation. The view has been advanced that the death, with no possibility of a resurrection, at Armageddon of hundreds of millions of people in countries like China or Pakistan or India, is justified by what is called community responsibility. The footnote reads, see The Watchtower, April 15, 1971, pages 285 to 287, June 15, 1965, pages 366 and 367. Awake. November 8, 1963, pages 27, 28. End of footnote. But this does little to satisfy such concern. The claim that when a government does not allow the Watchtower organization to be active in the country controlled by that government, the people, because they support the government, automatically share responsibility for the rejection of the Watchtower organization and its message, comes across as a very contrived effort at justification for the everlasting destruction of these many hundreds of millions of persons, men, women, and children. Particularly when the case is that the vast majority of the common people have not the faintest idea of what the Watchtower organization's message is, or perhaps are not even aware of its existence. The footnote reads, see, for example, The Watchtower of November 15, 1957, pages 694 and 695. End of footnote. In somewhat similar line of reasoning is an expression made at a district assembly held in New York in 1980 for French-speaking witnesses, mainly of Haitian background, living in that area. The footnote reads, the assembly was held August 7 to 10 in the Long Island City Assembly Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses. End of footnote. The Watchtower's president, Franz, spoke to the audience during the program, and in his talk related an experience he had had with a man who had previously studied for the Roman Catholic priesthood and who was now studying with Jehovah's Witnesses. He told of this man's questions about Armageddon and his asking if it could really be true that only those becoming Jehovah's Witnesses would survive Armageddon and that all others would suffer everlasting destruction. The president said his own answer was, "That's what the scriptures seem to indicate." The man responded, "But even little children?" The president said he replied, "Well, little nits eventually become lice, and little rats grow up to become big rats." His recounting this experience and these replies before the entire assembly clearly demonstrated his belief that such view had validity. Perhaps those answers might appeal to some, I cannot say. But I am sure they would prove deeply disturbing to others. I believe also that it is the self-centeredness of the organization's claims that obliges persons to come up with such extreme viewpoints, designed to give some semblance of validity to the dogmatic and exaggerated claims advanced about the importance of what that organization is doing. It is that same extremely exclusivistic position taken that causes the organization to discount whatever any other religious affiliations have done or are doing as having any part in the proclamation of the good news of the kingdom, or at least to minimize severely the importance of their efforts. In 1979, when accompanying witness missionaries in house-to-house activity in the West African country of Upper Volta, I remember noting that they carried with them 2 or even 3 different translations of the Bible, due to the several African languages spoken by the population of Ouagadougou, the country's capital. I thought then of the fact that so much of their witnessing would have been severely limited, crippled, were it not for having such translations. Yet those translations had not come to them through the Watchtower organization, they were produced by missionaries and translators of other religious affiliations. The achievement of translating the Bible, in whole, or in part, into more than 1,900 tongues is truly remarkable. The footnote reads, "See Awake. July 8, 1990, page 28. End of footnote. The Watchtower Society calls attention to the fact of the achievement but is reluctant to acknowledge the credit due to those who accomplished it, simply because they were not Jehovah's Witnesses. Yet the Bible is the very source of the good news, the place where the good news, as preached by Christ and his apostles and disciples, can be read in its original, unaltered, unadulterated form. In visiting not only Upper Volta, now Burkina Faso, but also Senegal, Mali, Ivory Coast, and Benin, I found that in any of those lands, where the major religions are animism and Islam, witnesses numbered only a few hundred at most. Yet on arriving at Cameroon I found more than 10,000 witnesses there. Why the contrast? The major difference was that Cameroon had a far larger percentage of the population professing Christianity. That circumstance, however, was the result of the earlier missionary activity of other religious organizations, Catholic and Protestant, and had been accomplished before the Watchtower organization ever appeared on the scene. And this situation is true in much of the world, that the degree of success of the Watchtower activity in any country is often parallel to the extent to which other church organizations previously had introduced the Bible to that country. In virtually every place where witnesses are found, other Christian affiliations had already been there and, to some degree at least, paved the way, especially in their translating the scriptures. Where such church systems have not already laid a foundation, the witnesses' efforts rarely bring any significant number of conversions. The footnote reads, even in China, where witnesses have established a bare foothold, there are some 4,000 Protestant churches that have reopened since the violent cultural revolution of 1966–76. In all, some 2.9 million Bibles have been produced in China just since 1980, and the provision in 1986 by the United Bible Society of $5 million in printing equipment stepped up production markedly. In view of the strong governmental restrictions that remain, this is all the more notable. Yet the ones promoting and accomplishing this task are, according to Watchtower doctrine, all classed as part of Babylon the great seductress and violent enemy of Christianity. End of footnote. To make it appear that, once the apostolic period of the first century had ended, little of anything was accomplished as to the spread of the good news for the next 17 centuries, until finally the Watchtower organization appeared in the late 1870s, is to make Jesus' words at Matthew, chapter 28 verse 18–20, seem quite hollow. His firm assurance to his followers in their disciple-making was that surely I will be with you always hence, at all times, continuously, to the very end of the age. How effective a witness! If the trumpet does not sound a clear call, who will get ready for battle? So it is with you. Unless you speak intelligible words with your tongue, how will anyone know what you are saying? You will just be speaking into the air. 1 Corinthians, chapter 14 verse 8, 9, New International Version. Aside from the quantity and extensiveness of this witnessing activity, what of its quality? Mere figures on a chart do not reveal this. Even on the surface, one can see obvious problems, that by far the majority of what is called declaring the good news is simply a presentation and distribution of books and magazines, the vast majority of which admittedly are never read. The footnote reads, see the statements by highly placed representatives quoted in Chapter 6, pages 188, 189, 198, 200, 203, to the effect that the reporting of hours and placement of literature are generally the goals of most publishers. End of footnote. During my 50 years of active service, I accompanied thousands of individual fellow witnesses in many countries as they went from door to door. Only rarely did I feel that what they said to people could qualify as anything approaching an effective witness for Christianity. The claim for decades was that by such activity the division of people into classes of sheep and goats was being effected under angelic direction, with a life or death outcome in the balance. I cannot believe that a just God would ever judge any human's worthiness for salvation on the basis of his or her acceptance or non-acceptance of the door-to-door presentations I have heard, or, for that matter, those I myself made in conforming to the organization's field service instructions. The overall mental impression left with most listeners is unquestionably that of persons interested in selling religious literature or in advocating their particular sectarian beliefs. The footnote reads, "Additional evidence for this ineffectiveness is undoubtedly seen in the remarkably great amount of time spent worldwide each year in comparison with the number of persons being baptized. During the 10 years 1981 to 1990, it took an average of 3,003 hours off-field service for every single person brought to the point of baptism. That is equivalent to a person spending 8 hours a day for 375 days in order to find and bring one person to baptism. The current average is more than double the average during the 1950s, then averaging 1,283 hours of field service per person baptized." End of footnote. Equally significant is the general lack of serious concern to extend further aid to those visited, an attitude that has been endemic in the organization from as far back as I can remember. This is certainly not true of all witnesses, but from a lifetime of association I can add my testimony to that of others already quoted that those of whom it is not are the exception rather than the rule. A predominant sense of satisfaction is manifest among most witnesses once the duty of having spent an hour or more in some door-to-door witnessing is done. They have put in their time and that is evidently their major preoccupation. The great majority of those who accept literature are not revisited. While an enormous quantity of literature is distributed, the effectiveness of this mammoth distribution is remarkably limited. One longtime elder, responding to an organizational request for comments in the late 1970s, wrote to the headquarters, "We have blanketed the United States of America with our literature, and to a lesser degree the rest of the world. When we honestly ask ourselves what proportion of the millions of books and magazines and booklets that we have published are ever read by the people, it would probably be alarming to us as to the few that have been. Even among our brothers, if we honestly look at the facts, probably less than half of the literature that comes into the homes of a dedicated family is ever read by most of the brothers." The footnote reads, "Memorandum from Dallas F. Wallace, during his lifetime a prominent elder and a leading figure in the acquisition of property by the organization." End of footnote. Another respected elder, similarly replying to an organizational request for observations, wrote, "As discussed previously, our literature is not being read by the publishers, witnesses or the public. About 1/3 of the publishers read the literature, far less of the public. In fact, I have had several elders tell me they feel guilty placing the 384-page and 416-page books with the public, because they felt the books were a drudgery when we studied them on Tuesday nights, they would not read them a second time themselves, and they wonder how the public could ever have an appetite for them if it affected them that way." The footnote reads, from memorandum submitted by Charles F. Liebensperger, March 1, 1978. He is a former headquarters staff member and still a prominent elder. End of footnote. A very large part of the witness that is given, then, in effect goes into the air, with no genuine, telling effect. It is as if the distribution of hundreds of millions of publications of itself supplies an organizational sense of accomplishment, with no real concern that the vast majority remains unread. Alternative methods or more effective methods of helping people than by door-to-door distribution of books and magazines are not explored, actually not even contemplated. A huge publishing system has been erected and it is steadily producing a great flood of literature that demands an outlet. The need to distribute takes precedence over other, more vital needs. In the past, the organization's monthly field service paper, Our Kingdom Ministry, has at times promoted giving greater stress to the Bible itself in the house-to-house activity. but invariably after a few months articles appear reminding the witnesses to keep on in offering the books and magazines, and a return to the usual pattern of principal emphasis on literature placement takes place. The good news about God's Son is called the glorious good news. The footnote reads, 2 Corinthians, chapter 4 verse 4. End of footnote. To restrict its being made known to, or to equate its proclamation essentially with, the distribution of denominational literature of any religious system is to reduce immeasurably its grandeur, to trivialize and cheapen it rather than magnify it. In discounting all that has been done by any other religious group in previous times, the Watchtower of May 1, 1981, page 17, states, "Let the honest-hearted person compare the kind of preaching of the gospel of the kingdom done by the religious systems of Christendom during all the centuries with that done by Jehovah's Witnesses since the end of World War I in 1918. They are not one and the same kind. That of Jehovah's Witnesses is really gospel, or good news, as of God's heavenly kingdom that was established by the enthronement of His Son Jesus Christ at the end of the Gentile times in 1914. As it itself acknowledges, the Watchtower organization has its own special kind of good news, tied in inextricably with a certain date. This, however, raises the following question: the original good news or an altered version? Even more crucial than the previous factors discussed is the issue of whether the good news of the kingdom thus preached is the same good news of the kingdom preached by Christ and His apostles. We have a clear presentation of what Jesus' apostles understood to be the good news. If one will simply take the Bible account and read the book of Acts and the various writings of the apostles, the contrast between their expression of the good news and that spoken at the doors by Jehovah's Witnesses is notable. The Watchtower message focuses on a good news that deals overwhelmingly with concerns about negative world conditions and the hope of early relief from the problems these bring, through the entrance of a perennially at-hand new world directed by a new heavenly government. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, April 15, 1983, pages 16 to 21, May 1, 1982, pages 8 to 11. Though heavenly, it is to have earthly representatives, princes, including prominent servants of God from the pre-Christian period and qualified men from among modern-day witnesses. See the Watchtower of August 15, 1989, page 17, Man's Salvation Out of World Distress at Hand. 1975, pages 360 to 365. End of footnote. That unquestionably has great appeal, since it is normal for human nature to feel more immediate concern about existing external pressures that bring nagging difficulties. The thought of a government is predominant in the mind of witnesses when they think of the kingdom, and their view of that government is notably similar to that of modern governments of our time. The footnote reads, the concern to draw such comparison is doubtless implicit in the reference to the kingdom as not simply a government but a real government, an actual governmental arrangement. See, for example, Reasoning from the Scriptures, page 226, The Watchtower, May 1, 1982, pages 9, 10. End of footnote. The Watchtower Society has, in fact, published both articles and talk outlines drawing parallels between the kingdom and such governments, depicting the administrative, legislative, judicial, and educational facets in both, including evidence of the kingdom's being a functioning government since 1914 in its providing and administering written laws and providing an educational program to its subjects, as also the ability to finance such a program, and even comparing the present population subject to that government with the population of various small countries. The footnote reads, examples may be found in Shining as Illuminators in the World, a 1977 manual for pioneer witnesses, pages 108 to 110, and The Watchtower of June 15, 1988, page 5. The May 1, 1982 Watchtower, page 10, contains a picture of U.S., British and Soviet political capitals, and a mountain symbolizing the kingdom, along with the caption, as human governments are real, so is the heavenly kingdom government. The Watchtower of January 1, 1991, page 4, states that in its numbers the witness nation now outranks some 60 of the 159 member nations of the UN. End of footnote. It seems remarkable, in this connection, that Watchtower writers can fail to see that their organization has done the same thing that they condemn in other religions, notably the Catholic Church. An article in the December 1, 1984, Watchtower, for example, speaks critically of Church Father Augustine's equating the kingdom with the church on earth, and quotes the summary of the effect of that teaching, page 6. Through the ecclesiastical hierarchy Christ is actualized as King of the kingdom of God. The area of the kingdom is coterminous, having the same boundaries with the frontiers of the church's power and authority. The kingdom of heaven is extended by the mission and advance of the church in the world. Yet this is virtually identical with what the Watchtower organization has done, and in the minds of its members seeking first the kingdom means essentially supporting, being submissive to, and working for the expansion of the visible organization. It boasts of the growing population within the frontiers of the organization and plainly expresses the view that their submission to the organization and its governing body equates with submission to Christ as King. The footnote reads, see Chapter 12, pages 426 to 429. End of footnote. It constantly applies to itself messianic prophecies originally spoken to the nation of Israel, God's typical government. In the January 15, 1988, Watchtower, for example, we read, pages 16, 17. Joyfully they cry out, you have added to the nation, O Jehovah, you have added to the nation, you have glorified yourself. You have extended afar all the borders of the land. Isaiah, chapter 26 verse 12, 15, in 210 lands around the earth, Jehovah continues to add sheep-like persons to his spiritual nation. Hundreds of thousands of new associates are being baptized. More kingdom halls and assembly halls are being built. Watchtower branches are extending their Bethel homes and factories and are adding printing equipment. The growth is continuous. This expansion comes because the Prince of Peace is directing the affairs of God's people on earth. As Isaiah states earlier in his prophecy, to the abundance of the princely rule and peace there will be no end, upon the throne of David and upon his kingdom, in order to establish it firmly and sustain it by means of justice and by means of righteousness from now on and to time indefinite. The very zeal of Jehovah of armies will do this. Isaiah, chapter 9 verse 6, 7, how grandly those words have been fulfilled today. As the article itself states, the fulfillment is seen, not in truly spiritual aspects, but in numerical growth, which brings more persons under the organization's authority, and organizational expansion in properties, buildings, and equipment. Augustine's equation of the kingdom with the church is paralleled by the Watchtower's equation of the kingdom with the earthly visible organization. The constant emphasis on the idea of government undoubtedly contributes markedly to the willingness of witnesses to subject their thinking and their consciences to a religious system, to their acceptance of the imposition of a growing volume of theocratic law, numerous organizational rules and policies that must be observed. It is advantageous to such an authoritarian arrangement for congregational elders and traveling representatives to be thought of, not simply as humble servants of Christ and fellow disciples, but as government representatives empowered to administer the laws and policies of a functioning governmental system. The footnote reads, this aura of impressive governmental authority is enhanced by the teaching that qualified ones among these elders will become princes in the new order. Jude's words about disregarding lordship and speaking abusively of glorious ones are also applied to anointed followers who serve faithfully as appointed Christian overseers, and to responsible men in the congregation, with warning against failure to show submission to these men as the glorious ones referred to. See the Watchtower of August 15, 1982, pages 28, 29, January 15, 1979, page 25. End of footnote. Corollary to this emphasis on government, the Watchtower Society, at least from and after 1935, has developed what one French writer described as a gospel of spiritual materialism, that is, an appeal to materialistic desires wrapped in spiritual terms. This is done by constant stress on the prospect of soon being able to enjoy endless material and physical benefits, with an abundance of choice food, with beautiful homes in lovely surroundings, with a return from the wrinkles, weakness and pains of old age to the vibrant health, beauty and strength of deathless youth, all this free from taxation, inflation, high costs of health and life insurance, accidents, disasters, crime, and war. No sane person would fail to find such a prospect attractive. Any politician who could convince people he could effect such a change would win immediate election in any country. But the motivation for desiring such a problem-free, materially and physically ideal life actually demands no greater spirituality, certainly no greater Christianity, than that which moved Ponce de Leon to seek the fountain of eternal youth, or for the followers of Mohammed to desire the paradise of the seventh heaven, with its very earthly kind of delights. The footnote reads, The Watchtower Publications Index 1986 to 1989, page 130, under Kingdom contains the subtopic Blessings to Earthly Subjects. In its references one does find such items as the fatherhood of Jesus Christ, relationship with Jehovah, and spiritual prosperity, but these constitute a very small fraction of the approximately 43 listings. Most of them are about subjects such as babies healthy, crime ended, depression cured, deserts blossom, ecology restored, economic management, economic slavery ended, food abundant, forests restored, handicaps removed, natural forces controlled, peace with animals, pollution ended, population equilibrium, poverty ended, and so forth. The predominance of these listings reflects accurately the degree of emphasis placed on the promised satisfying of material and physical desires found in the magazines and books they refer to. End of footnote. The major problem in all this is that it is a greatly altered, embroidered, good news when compared with the good news that Christ's followers preached, as recorded in the Christian scriptures. Their message, and the language they used, focused, not on a government, but on a person, the person of God's Son, Christ Jesus. The footnote reads, compare Acts, chapter 8 verse 12 with Acts, chapter 5 verse 42, 8 verse 4, 5, 35. End of footnote. Unlike that proclaimed in the first century, the good news as presented by the Watchtower organization is one appealing strongly to the physical senses and desires. Compare such texts as 2 Corinthians, chapter 4 verse 16 to 18 and Colossians chapter 3 verse 2. Pictures from the 1982 publication, You Can Live Forever in Paradise on Earth. Pages 157 to 162. These are typical of the appeal to physical desires made particularly from 1935 onward. The expression Christ's kingdom primarily carries the meaning of Christ's reign or dominion or Christ's kingly rule. The footnote reads, the term kingdom as found in the Christian scriptures comes from the Greek term basileia, which does not have the modern sense of a government which the Watchtower Society would like to give it. As the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament states, the term refers to the being or nature or state of a king, that is to say, his dignity, and secondarily the expression of this in the territory he governs. The sense of dignity is primary in the LXX, Philo, and the NT. The focus is on a person, even as in Oriental lands the kingdom resided, as to power and authority, in the person of the king. Reference works as a whole combine to show that the sense is that of kingship or reign, not the idea of a governmental organization as persons today think of it. While the meaning of the term basileia may also refer to the domain in which the rulership is exercised, that sense is secondary. End of footnote. Since God is the sovereign source of Christ's kingship and since this is God's own arrangement, the expression the kingdom of God is often used as a synonym for the kingly rule of his Son. The footnote reads, compare Luke, chapter 19 verse 11 to 15, Revelation, chapter 12 verse 10. It may be noted that in verses 12 and 15 of the passage in Luke the New World Translation renders basileia by kingly power, while in the footnotes of certain editions it shows the alternative rendering of kingdom. The nobleman in the parable of Luke, chapter 19 did not travel to a far country to receive, and return with, a government but kingship and kingly authority. End of footnote. To speak of Christ's kingdom then is primarily to speak of Christ's rulership, and if one keeps that in mind in reading scriptural references to the kingdom, a considerably different sense comes through from that found in Watchtower publications. One has but to read the expressions of Christ's apostles to see that when they spoke of the kingdom it was predominantly in that sense which focuses on the person of the Son of God and his lordship. The expression good news of the kingdom means simply the good news of Christ's rulership. We find the expression good news more than 100 times in all the Christian scriptures. Among these, only 8 times does the expression good news of the kingdom occur. In all the other cases the good news is either specifically stated to be the good news about the Christ, or similar expressions, or the context shows that the reference is to him, the person, not to a government. The foundation and essence of the good news. What did the apostles and other Christian writers emphasize in describing that messianic rulership and its effects? They consistently pointed to Christ's ransom sacrifice, his victory over King Sin and death on behalf of all mankind, the authority the Father has given to his resurrected Son to liberate from the wages of sin and death all those who put faith in him. That was, and is, the good news the Bible itself brings us. The biblical good news does not draw attention to, nor is it tied up with, some date, whether 1914 or any other date, nor does it attract by offers of alluring physical and material benefits just around the corner. It is tied up with an event, the event in which God's Son fulfilled his primary mission as the Messiah and gave his life on our behalf, thereafter being resurrected to God's right hand and serving as our advocate there. The footnote reads, 1 John, chapter 2 verse 1, 2, consider also Peter's preaching at Pentecost and when addressing Gentiles in the home of Cornelius, as recorded at Acts, chapter 2 verse 14 to 36, 10 verse 34 to 43. End of footnote. Only for this reason could Paul say to the Corinthians, I decided not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him impaled. The footnote reads, 1 Corinthians, chapter 2 verse 2, compare 2 Timothy, chapter 2 verse 8. End of footnote. That central event of the good news is an event of 1900 years past, yet it remains the event of supreme importance for all of us today. The fact that our own personal realization of its full benefit is yet future in no way changes the fact that the most crucial event in human history took place back then and will not be surpassed by any future event. The future is, in fact, governed irresistibly by that past act. Whatever future benefits we yet receive are, in reality, after effects of that act. The apostles plainly saw matters in this light, recognizing the overriding, overpowering finality and the determinative, preemptive nature of that event, Christ's death and resurrection, and the effect of placing faith in the reconciliation and redemption made possible thereby. Only thus could they have spoken as they did, speaking of themselves and fellow Christians as though already possessing the highest blessings and benefits made possible by that ransom sacrifice. There is unquestionably a danger in focusing on the present to the detracting of the future fulfillment of God's promises. Compare 2 Corinthians, chapter 4 verse 8, 5 verse 1 to 10. An example of this wrong viewpoint is presented at 2 Timothy, chapter 2 verse 17, 18. Compare also 1 Corinthians 15 verse 12, hope is a principal Christian element and hope relates to what is future. 1 Corinthians, chapter 13 verse 13. There is nonetheless detriment in a failure to recognize the fact that many of God's promises have, in a spiritual sense, a present application in the lives of Christians. The sealing or stamping of God's servants by His Holy Spirit is presented as a pledge or deposit, advance installment at, token in advance, the New World Translation, guaranteeing their promised inheritance. Ephesians, chapter 4 verse 13, 14, this present application of many of God's promises has a faith-strengthening and hope-strengthening effect that merits serious recognition. Obviously, the complete and total realization of the Christian hope still lies ahead. The Apostle Peter thus writes of the new heavens and new earth that we are awaiting according to his promise. The footnote reads, 2 Peter, chapter 3 verse 13. End of footnote. At the same time, both he and other writers of the Christian scriptures speak of many of God's promises as already undergoing fulfillment toward believers, either actually or in a spiritual sense. They were at one and the same time both spiritual prospects and spiritual realities, sometimes expressed as the already not yet element of scriptural presentation of these promises. While not losing from sight that the ultimate fulfillment is yet future, we can see that this present fulfillment is true of much, possibly even the entirety, of what is stated in the passage of Revelation, chapter 21 verse 1-5, to which witnesses regularly refer as describing a future new world. They fail to realize that in the preceding Christian writings most of the things set out as produced by the New Jerusalem are also spoken of as, in a vital sense, already in existence at the time of those writings. The footnote reads, Revelation, chapter 1 verse 1 says of the revelation given to John that it was to show the things that must shortly take place. Yet, while its visions frequently pointed to the future, particularly in connection with God's ultimate acts of judgment, a reading of Revelation demonstrates that many of the things stated had either already occurred or were then taking place. Chapters 2 and 3, as just an example, deal with conditions in 7 Asia Minor congregations, conditions that were current at the time, not something future. The visions in chapter 4 of God's celestial glory, of the sacrificial lamb and his purchase of mankind, were not of future circumstances or events but of circumstances and events that were then in effect. The river of the water of life of Revelation chapter 22 was certainly then flowing, so that the invitation to anyone that wishes to come and take life's water free did not need to wait till the distant future but was already being extended to people through the making known of the good news. Revelation, chapter 22 verse 1-2, 17, compare John, chapter 4 verse 7-14, 6 verse 35, 7 verse 37, 38. Only by comparing the visions with that which is stated elsewhere in the Christian scriptures can the present or future element and application be determined, for it is a sound rule that the symbolic must always be understood by, and conform in meaning to, that which is factually and clearly stated elsewhere, never the other way around. End of footnote. Revelation, chapter 21 verse 3, for example, speaks of the tent of God being with mankind, of his residing with them and their being his people, God himself being with them. The scriptures show that Christ's ransom sacrifice brought about the reconciliation of believing men and women with God, bringing them from a state of enmity to one of peace and friendship with God. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 5 verse 10, 8 verse 7, Luke, chapter 16 verse 9, compare James, chapter 2 verse 23. End of footnote. For that reason the apostle could speak of Christians at that very time as a temple of a living God in which God's Spirit dwells, a place for God to inhabit by Spirit, and could quote the prophecy of Isaiah where the very same expression is found at Revelation chapter 21, just as God said, I shall reside among them and walk among them, and I shall be their God, and they will be my people. The footnote reads, 2 Corinthians, chapter 6 verse 16, see also 1 Corinthians, chapter 3 verse 16, Ephesians, chapter 2 verse 22. End of footnote. The apostle presents this promise of God's dwelling with men and their becoming his people as having attained fulfillment. He did not present it as something future but as a relationship already in effect. His fellow apostle, Peter, clearly states, you were once not a people, but are now God's people. The footnote reads, 1 Peter, chapter 2 verse 10. End of footnote. Because of Christ's sacrifice, and the reconciliation with his Father it made possible, in the first century the tent of God was indeed with men and he was now residing among them and they were his people, even as depicted in the Revelation account. The footnote reads, we may also note that in Hebrews chapters 8-10 the inspired writer shows that the earlier earthly tabernacle, in which God was symbolically present among his people Israel, pictured God's greater, heavenly tent, and says that this was as an illustration for the appointed time that is now here. Hebrews, chapter 9 verse 9, he goes on to make plain that the heavenly tent was already in place, and that Christ, as high priest of the good things that have come to pass, was even then ministering there on behalf of sinful mankind. Hebrews, chapter 9 verse 11. End of footnote. In the Revelation account, verse 4 states that God will wipe out every tear from their eyes, and death will be no more, neither will mourning nor outcry nor pain be any more. The first portion of this verse, as to God's wiping out every tear and death being no more, exactly corresponds in content to the words of Isaiah, chapter 25 verse 8. At 1 Corinthians 15 verse 54 the Apostle Paul quoted from that part of Isaiah's prophecy, not as pointing to some earthly paradisiac conditions, as the Watchtower publications regularly do, but with regard to the resurrection of Christians and their passing from mortality to immortality. Yet, in a sense, the victory over death had already been gained for them, its sting had been annulled. Though Christians were still subject physically to death, in a very vital sense they were beyond its power and could remain beyond it by maintaining faith in Christ's superior ransoming power. They knew that God had made them alive though they were previously dead in their trespasses and sins. The footnote reads, Ephesians, chapter 2 verse 1. End of footnote. Having died to sin and having been raised to newness of life, for them the reign of King Death had ended, through Christ's rulership they were no longer under King Death's dominion and law. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 5 verse 21, 6 verse 4. End of footnote. For that reason the Apostle John could say, We know not that we will pass over, but that we have passed over from death to life, because we love the brothers. The footnote reads, 1 John, chapter 3 verse 14. End of footnote. In so saying, he was simply repeating Jesus' identical expressions in which Jesus spoke of those putting faith in him as already possessing everlasting life because of that faith. The footnote reads, John, chapter 3 verse 36, 5 verse 24 39, 40, 6 verse 47, 20 verse 31. End of footnote. That is evidently why Jesus could say, not only that he that exercises faith in me, even though he dies, will come to life, but also that everyone that is living and exercises faith in me will never die at all. The footnote reads, John, chapter 11 verse 26, compare Romans, chapter 6 verse 9 to 11. End of footnote. All these powerful statements are certainly the equivalent in force of the Revelation statement, and death will be no more, and they all show that these results of Christ's ransom were already in effect among his followers. As for mourning, outcry, and pain, Christ had come precisely to carry out the commission foretold in earlier prophecy, namely to preach good news to the poor, to bind up the broken-hearted, to comfort all who mourn, and provide the oil of gladness instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of despair. The footnote reads, Isaiah, chapter 61 verse 1 to 3, New International Version. End of footnote. He did not fail in that commission and could say in the synagogue in Nazareth, Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. The footnote reads, Luke, chapter 4 verse 18 to 21. End of footnote. His promise, Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh, did not need to wait until the distant future to begin having fulfillment, even as the other parts of the Sermon on the Mount did not require that long wait to experience realization. Rather than express outcry upon suffering mistreatment at the hands of men, his disciples were to rejoice and leap for joy. The footnote reads, Luke, chapter 6 verse 22-23, compare James, chapter 1 verse 2, 9-12. End of footnote. Even the reference to the removal of pain does not require the fulfillment of this revelation vision to be solely a future one. The context in no way specifies it to be pain such as often accompanies illness or physical trauma. The translation of the term used by the Apostle John, Greek ponos, is itself a matter of the translator's choice, since the word basically means toil and only by implication pain or anguish. The footnote reads, See the New Englishman's Greek Concordance and Lexicon, page 738. End of footnote. Thus the French translation by d'Osterveld assigns it its basic sense, rendering it by travail, toil, and the Spanish translations by Nacarcalunga and Boyer Cantero both render it by trabajo, work. The footnote reads, the Jerusalem Bible renders it as sadness. End of footnote. Christ gave the appealing invitation to all those toiling and loaded down to come to him and find, right then, and from then onward, refreshment and rest for their souls. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 11 verse 28 to 30. End of footnote. Their religious leaders had laid heavy burdens upon them through their rigid, unrelenting legalism and their stressing the gaining of a righteous standing with God by means of specific works. Jesus likened this to putting heavy loads on men's shoulders, something certainly painful to carry. The good news brought by God's Son enabled them to become free of all these burdens, free from the frustration and weariness of endeavoring to satisfy such burdensome requirements, and thus end the pain, both emotional and mental, such struggle brought. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 23 verse 1 to 4, 12 verse 1 to 13, 15 verse 1 to 11. We may note that at Acts, chapter 15 verse 10 the Apostle Peter also speaks of the law itself as a yoke that neither our forefathers nor we were capable of bearing. Christ set them free from such heavy yoke. End of footnote. The expressions, the former things have passed away and look, I am making all things new, are likewise clearly paralleled by statements in the apostolic writings, with reference to a relationship and circumstance then present, not limited to some distant future time. The footnote reads, Revelation, chapter 21 verse 4, 5. End of footnote. In almost identical language to that of Revelation, the Apostle writes, Consequently if anyone is in union with Christ, he is a new creation, the old things passed away, look, new things have come into existence. The footnote reads, 2 Corinthians, chapter 5 verse 17. End of footnote. How true those words were at that very time. An old covenant had been replaced by a new one, and God's laws were now written in the hearts of those joined to his Son. Though previously dead in sin, Christians had been raised to live a new life, as if having had a new birth, serving in the new way of the Spirit and not in the old way of the written code. Believers, both Jew and Gentile, were formed into one new man and reconciled with God, entering into the relationship of sons of God. A new force now molded their thinking and they cast off their old life course and clothed themselves with a new course, one constantly renewed in the likeness of its Creator. No longer subject to and dependent upon some human priesthood in their approach to God, they could now draw near to God with full assurance by a new and living way, opened to them by their one high priest and mediator, God's Son. The footnote reads, Hebrews, chapter 8 verse 7 to 10, 1 Peter, chapter 12 verse 3, Romans, chapter 6 verse 11, 7 verse 6, 8 verse 10 to 14, Ephesians, chapter 2 verse 14 to 18, 4 verse 22 to 24, Colossians, chapter 3 verse 9, 10, Hebrews, chapter 10 verse 19 to 22. End of footnote. In all of the above cases the already and not yet factors apply with the hope of the ultimate realization yet to be fulfilled, but with that hope greatly fortified by the dispensations now in effect. Transferal into the kingdom. What a marvelous change Christ's sacrificial act had produced for his disciples, and what a marvelous entry into a genuinely new relationship it introduced. Christ does indeed have a spiritual nation over which he rules, but it is composed of all persons on earth who have put their faith in him and who render submission to him as the spiritual head and as the sole mediator between themselves and God. The footnote reads, 1 Peter, chapter 2 verse 4 to 9. 1 Corinthians, chapter 11 verse 3, 1 Timothy, chapter 2 verse 5 and 6. End of footnote. Organizational subjection and boundaries and numerical growth have nothing to do with this. Nor are they related to the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies. These have indeed seen fulfillment, but in a more extensive and far different way than the Watchtower organization's explanations present. This transferal of God's servants into Christ's kingdom is in no way tied in with organizational affiliation, nor with the date 1914. It extends all the way back to the 1st century and Christ's providing redemption through the sacrifice of himself. The scriptures show that his disciples had even then been delivered from the authority of darkness and transplanted into the kingdom of the Son of his love. The footnote reads, Colossians, chapter 1 verse 13. End of footnote. The Apostle Paul could therefore say of God, He raised us up together and seated us together in the heavenly places in union with Christ Jesus. The footnote reads, Ephesians, chapter 2 verse 6. End of footnote. He did not speak of this as future but used the past tense, raised, not will raise, seated, not will seat, in describing the spiritually lofty position that their transferal into the kingdom of the Son of his love had effected. Because of their delivery from the authority of darkness they were now as if seated with the heavenly King, God's Son. Jesus had said, Happy are the mild-tempered ones, since they will inherit the earth. Happy are the peaceable, since they will be called sons of God. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 5 verse 5, 9. End of footnote. As a result of Christ's death and resurrection and their faith in the power of this, his followers had now become sons of God and therefore also became joint heirs of Christ and heirs of God, to whom the earth and its fullness belongs. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 8 verse 14 to 17, Galatians, chapter 3 verse 29, 4 verse 4 to 6, 1 Corinthians, chapter 10 verse 26, Psalm, chapter 24 verse 1, 1 Corinthians 10 verse 25-26. End of footnote. Because they were now adopted into God's royal family, the apostle could speak in the present tense when saying to his fellow Christians, All things belong to you, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or things now here or things to come, all things belong to you, in turn you belong to Christ, Christ, in turn, belongs to God. The footnote reads, 1 Corinthians, chapter 3 verse 21 to 23, Romans, chapter 8 verse 17, Galatians, chapter 4 verse 6, 7. End of footnote. In similar vein, the Apostle Peter wrote, also in present tense, You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for special possession, that you should declare abroad the excellencies of the one that called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. The footnote reads, 1 Peter, chapter 2 verse 9. End of footnote. They were not merely priests of God but royal priests, and the term royal in the Greek, basileus, is from the same root as the word for kingdom, basileia. Peter states that the Christians to whom he wrote were already at that time a kingly priesthood or a kingdom of priests. The footnote reads, This understanding of the Greek phrase is also indicated by the Greek Septuagint rendering of Exodus, chapter 19 verse 6, where the Hebrew expression a kingdom of priests appears. See the Expositor's Greek Testament, volume 5, page 57. End of footnote. At Revelation, chapter 1 verse 6, John therefore employs the past tense in saying of Christ that he made us to be a kingdom, made of us a royal house, the New English Bible, priests to his God and Father. All this certainly must be considered in understanding later expressions in the book of Revelation, as when Revelation, chapter 5 verse 10 says, You made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God and they are to rule as kings over the earth. The footnote reads, As the interlinear reading of the Kingdom interlinear translation of the Greek scriptures shows, the verb rendered to rule is in the present tense in Greek, they are reigning. End of footnote. It may be noted that the New World Translation here reads over the earth, yet the Watchtower's own chart in the front of the Kingdom interlinear translation shows that the Greek preposition here used, ap, has the fundamental sense of upon not over, Greek hyper. While ap can be rendered as over when the context calls for such a change from its fundamental sense, that change, as can be seen, is hardly a required one here. Virtually every other translation thus reads on the earth or upon the earth. Whatever the case, all the earlier quoted apostolic statements clearly demonstrate that Christ's disciples on the earth were already a kingdom and priests of God in a spiritual sense. They were part of God's royal family, sons of the king, and the king's power acted on them and through them. Their royal position as sons of the King of the universe did not express itself in earthly majesty or material wealth, nor in any exercise of political power, or of dictating to others as though exalted above and superior to them. The footnote reads, compare 1 Corinthians, chapter 4 verse 8, Revelation, chapter 3 verse 17, 18. End of footnote. But their Father, to whom the nations are as a drop from a bucket, and as the film of dust on the scales, to whom all the inhabitants of the earth are being considered as merely nothing, and who is doing according to his own will among the army of the heavens and the inhabitants of the earth, had, in his sovereign authority, empowered them as his royal representatives to accomplish his mission on earth, to speak out his kingly decrees and judgments. The footnote reads, Isaiah, chapter 40 verse 15, 17, Daniel, chapter 4 verse 35, Acts, chapter 17 verse 30-31. End of footnote. Long ago Jehovah commissioned Jeremiah to be over nations and over the kingdoms, in order to uproot and to pull down and to destroy and to tear down, to build and to plant. He did that, not by placing Jeremiah as a literal ruler over them, but simply by putting his words in Jeremiah's mouth, for God's word is powerful, irresistible, and what he foretells is as good as done. The footnote reads, Jeremiah, chapter 1 verse 9, 10, Isaiah, chapter 55 verse 11, 44 verse 26, Romans, chapter 4 verse 17. End of footnote. Having spoken to mankind by prophets, God has now spoken to us by his Son, and the word or message spoken by him was itself to serve as a judge toward all mankind. The footnote reads, Hebrews, chapter 1 verse 1 and 2. John, chapter 12 verse 48. End of footnote. That Son, from his ascension onward, has exercised all authority in heaven and in earth, and his disciples and joint heirs on earth have the royal privilege of making his word known. Presented free from alteration or adulteration, that word has its own resultant judging effect. The footnote reads, Matthew, chapter 28 verse 18-20, Acts, chapter 13 verse 44-48, 28 verse 23-28. End of footnote. As disciples of his Son, they serve in the confidence that God's sovereign power backs them and sustains them, and that there is nothing on earth that he cannot or will not use for their blessing and support, for they are part of his royal family. They will never lack anything they truly need to continue on and fulfill their purpose on earth. They will never lose anything of genuine and lasting value. For, if God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation, will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 8 verse 31-39, New International Version. End of footnote. This is indeed the best of news for those who see the superior and crucial value of spiritual blessings. That genuine good news is, lamentably, obscured when people are instead encouraged to focus their thoughts and desires on essentially material benefits perpetually depicted as just ahead in a substitute good news of human conception. Witnesses, if they give the matter any thought, can hardly fail to recognize that the good news as presented in the first century is a different version from what they are accustomed to hearing and reading and speaking at the doors, as if the original version had become somehow outdated, outmoded, not suited to the present. The Apostle Paul said to the Corinthians that, when coming to them, he had decided not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him impaled. The footnote reads, 1 Corinthians, chapter 2 verse 1, 2. End of footnote. If any traveling watchtower representative today were to make such a statement, he would immediately be viewed with suspicion as though of a different religion. If a speaker at a meeting were simply to paraphrase one of Paul's letters, such as his letter to the Ephesians, without first informing his audience that this is what he was doing, he, too, would be viewed as sounding strange, speaking a different language than what his listeners were accustomed to, and as though representative of a different religion. I believe anyone reviewing that inspired letter and thinking on the matter would acknowledge this as true. Remarkably little time is spent in consideration of the grand Christian teachings earlier presented, and this is not surprising since they are viewed as applicable to less than 1%, actually only two-tenths of 1%, 0.2%, of the organization's total membership. The life-changing power of the good news today's world and the existing political rule of earth undeniably produce many problems, irritations, frustrations, hardships, even sufferings, for us all. But all of them together pale by comparison with the disastrous, humanly inescapable and irremediable effects upon us of the rule of King Sin and Death. The footnote reads, Romans, chapter 5 verse 21. End of footnote. In the first century, the good news was that those placing faith in Christ's ransoming act might now become free from the burdening sense of guilt their sinful state had induced, that their sins were fully forgiven and they were reconciled to God and at peace and in friendship with Him. Far more, they were now accepted by Him into His family as His children, sons of the Most High. The repetitive sacrifices made under the law covenant and by means of a special priestly class had constantly served as a reminder of sin, with its accompanying sense of guilt, and no matter how many sacrifices the people had made over the years, there was always the realization that this was still insufficient to actually attain righteousness and the reward of life for them. But now with His one sacrifice, Christ had put an end to any further need for sin-atoning sacrifices. The footnote reads, Hebrews, chapter 10 verse 1-4. End of footnote. Now God's servants could offer up a totally different form of sacrifice, sacrifices of praise and of love. These were expressed, not in deeds done according to procedures and regulations, but in deeds which were motivated freely and spontaneously from the heart, with no sense of atoning for sin, or working off its debt and accompanying sense of guilt thereby. Those first-century Christians had entered into God's rest, with such struggling, repetitive efforts at proving their own righteousness now a thing of the past. The footnote reads, Hebrews, chapter 4 verse 3, 10. End of footnote. Before this, access to God's presence as symbolized in the most holy of the temple, was limited to the few, the priesthood. Anyone else attempting to draw near by entry therein did so at peril of his life. But now that Christ had become their high priest in heaven at God's right hand, His followers could all, personally and individually, have boldness for the way of entry into the holy place by the blood of Jesus, and were actually encouraged to approach with freeness of speech to the throne of undeserved kindness, without having to rely on any human intermediaries in doing so. The footnote reads, Hebrews, chapter 4 verse 14-16. End of footnote. No more were they under a law code, one that constantly reminded them of their weakness and failure to measure up to its perfection, for now God's laws were written in their minds and hearts. They would no longer need a specialized priestly class to teach them to know Him, for they would all, from the least one to the greatest one, know Him, and He would no longer call their sins to mind. The footnote reads, Hebrews, chapter 8 verse 10-13, Galatians, chapter 4 verse 6-9. End of footnote. Service to Him could be, as never before, a genuine source of joy. For the vast majority of Jehovah's Witnesses, the power of the good news is regrettably robbed of much of its gladdening and strengthening force. The greatness of what God through Christ has already done for us, the overriding significance of Christ's victories over sin, death, the world and its ruler, the blessedness of the relationship opened up to all of mankind who will exercise faith in Him, are seriously minimized. All this is the result of the organization's efforts to uphold its teaching of two classes of Christians, with one class, the immense majority, having no standing with God on their own but only by virtue of association with the other class. The original good news, and all that it offers now, is restricted as applying to just a few thousand persons and, in effect, is placed in the background and overshadowed by the gospel of soon to be enjoyed, just around the corner material and physical benefits. The great mass of the membership are told that entrance into the new covenant, and even the present full forgiveness of sins producing a righteous standing and sonship with God, are not yet for them. The Watchtower teachings have, in effect, turned back the clock for them so that their situation remains much like that of persons before Christ's coming and ransoming act. It is as if these millions of the so-called great crowd class were still in the time of the Old Covenant, when even within the nation of Israel the people were divided into a priestly and a non-priestly class. Thus the 4 million or so non-anointed are told that they have approached to God and a standing with Him only through having a relationship with the anointed currently of the organization. The footnote reads, Watchtower publications have applied the words in Zechariah, chapter 8 verse 23 as to 10 men out of all the languages of the nations taking hold of the skirt of a Jew, as applying to the great crowd of non-anointed persons who have figuratively taken hold of the skirt of the anointed remnant of Jehovah's Witnesses, and, utilizing Revelation, chapter 3 verse 9, the publications say of these non-anointed ones that they come to Jesus' anointed brothers and bow down to them, spiritually speaking, because they have heard that God is with them, and they minister to these anointed ones. See Revelation, its grand climax at hand, page 60, 61, also the Watchtower of January 1, 1988, page 16, Worldwide Security under the Prince of Peace, 1986, pages 88, 89. End of footnote. This would mean that these in effect thereby act as a priesthood mediating on behalf of all the others to make them acceptable to God. The offerings of service the latter make have no validity unless made in that context. The footnote reads, contrast Exodus, chapter 30 verse 30 to 33, Leviticus, chapter 2 verse 1, 2, 5 verse 10, 17 verse 1 to 5, Numbers, chapter 4 verse 15, 17, 18, 18 verse 7 with 1 John, chapter 2 verse 20, Hebrews, chapter 4 verse 14 to 16, 8 verse 1, 2, 10 to 12, 10 verse 19 to 22, 13 verse 15, 16. End of footnote. Christ is declared to be mediator only for the 8,000 or so anointed remaining on earth, not for the millions of others associated. The footnote reads, The Watchtower, August 15, 1989, pages 30, 31. End of footnote. A reversion to Old Covenant circumstances. Under the Old Covenant, the priesthood served as a superior court where all difficult matters were to be decided, and their decisions were binding. As the law stated, they must hand down to you the word of the judicial decision. Then you must do in accordance with the word that they will hand down to you from the place which Jehovah will choose, and you must be careful to do according to all that they instruct you. In accordance with the law that they will point out to you, and according to the judicial decisions that they will say to you, you should do. You must not turn aside from the word that they will hand down to you, to the right or to the left. The footnote reads, Deuteronomy, chapter 17 verse 8 to 13. End of footnote. No better description could be given of the view Jehovah's Witnesses today take toward decisions handed down to them by the Watchtower organization and its governing body, who stand for them as if in the position of the Old Covenant priesthood. In Crisis of Conscience reference was made to an expression used by some traveling overseers who, after holding up a green Watchtower publication, said that if the organization tells us this book is black, then, brothers, it is black. The footnote reads, Crisis of Conscience, pages 344, 345. End of footnote. I would have thought that such a blatant advocating of blind credulity, a statement so utterly devoid of intelligence, would soon have disappeared, recognized for what it was and dying from its own stupidity. Yet years later persons who have corresponded with me and who are as yet associated with the organization relate this same expression being used in their area, not only in the United States but in other countries, including Australia. The footnote reads, "The person who communicated this information from Australia immigrated there from Germany." He wrote that on hearing this expression of the organization's authority to make green become black, stated by a district overseer at a meeting for elders, he murmured to himself, "Heil Hitler." End of footnote. Back in the year 1541, in his writing Exercitia Spirituali, the founder of the Jesuit order, Ignatius Loyola, wrote, "We should always be disposed to believe that that which appears to us to be white is really black, if the hierarchy of the Church so decides." Today, few Catholics would agree with Loyola, yet these words describe the precise mentality developed among many, if not most, of Jehovah's Witnesses, particularly among its traveling overseers. Another popular expression that has caught on with some traveling representatives and elders is, "If the organization tells us to jump, our only question should be how high." Similarly, to those who question the truthfulness and scripturalness of certain teachings, the cliché, used in reply by some of these men is, "I would rather be wrong with the organization than be right and be alone." This surrender of all personal judgment not only says something of the type of persons who are viewed as qualified for responsibility by the organization. Because such incredibly shallow clichés and calls for blind, unthinking obedience are not forcefully repudiated by either the organization or by the great majority of hearers, it also reveals the degree to which the organization and its governing body now are viewed as equivalent to the priesthood of ancient Israel. Those expressions to all intents and purposes repeat the words of the Old Covenant, "You must not turn aside from the word that they will hand down to you, to the right or to the left." The organization with its governing body stands where the Aaronic priesthood stood. It is as if the liberating Messiah had not yet come. In some respects the position of these millions of the so-called great crowd is less than that of non-priestly Israelites, for they are likened by the Watchtower publications to spiritual Gentiles. The Gentiles living in Israel, if approaching God's temple, had to stop at a wall in the courtyard of the Gentiles, a wall containing the inscription, "Let no foreigner enter," inside of the barrier and the fence around the sanctuary. Whosoever is caught will be responsible for his death which will ensue. The footnote reacts, see the Watchtower October 1, 1972, pages 606, 607. December 1, 1972, page 721, 722, Insight on the Scriptures, Volume 2, pages 1079 to 1080. End of footnote. Whereas, through his death, Christ tore down the wall dividing Jews and Gentiles, a wall that caused persons to be excluded from citizenship in Israel and to be as foreigners to the covenants of the promise, the Watchtower organization erects a new wall, spiritually dividing the anointed spiritual Israelites, today numbering some 8,600, from the spiritual Gentiles, numbering into the millions, and placing the latter in a figurative courtyard of the Gentiles. The footnote reads, Ephesians, chapter 2 verse 11 to 18, New International Version. End of footnote. For a Gentile to cross the dividing wall in that courtyard was considered a desecration. For any non-anointed person to cross the spiritual wall the Watchtower doctrine erects, as by partaking of the emblems at the Lord's evening meal, an act which scripturally signifies nothing more or less than an expression of faith in the ransom sacrifice, or by viewing themselves as in the new covenant Christ mediated on behalf of mankind, would be treated as a similar desecration, an invasion of a holy precinct. Even the Christian scriptures, they are told, were not written for, or directed to, them but for and to the anointed. Paradoxically, all the responsibilities in those Christian scriptures somehow are applied by the organization to these millions of non-anointed members, while the chief privileges are withheld. In a sense, the upside-down view of the organization makes it appear as if being a joint heir of Christ, a position only the so-called anointed class are said to occupy, is a privilege less demanding in its requirements than that of the great crowd class. The anointed ones enter into their privileged position as justified sons of God right away, and at their death, in some cases after only a relatively few years of service, have their inheritance assured and at God's day of judgment are immediately accepted into God's presence, not 1,000 years later. Not so with the great crowd class. Their time has not yet come and, if they would see it, they must not only labor dutifully under the organization's direction but thereafter endure a great tribulation. Nor is this the end, for after this they are in effect under trial for 1,000 years, since the millennium is represented as a 1,000-year judgment day. Christ's sacrifice brought believers out from under law into God's undeserved kindness or grace. According to the Watchtower view, those surviving Armageddon go back under law, as the book Babylon the Great has fallen. God's kingdom rules. States in its explanation of Revelation, chapter 20 verse 12, 13. The scrolls that the Apostle John saw opened are not the record of the past earthly life of the people standing before the judgment throne, but are the law books of Jehovah. That is, they are the publications setting forth his will for all people on earth during Christ's millennial reign. After what is written in these law scrolls has been published and made known, the people will be judged by what laws and instructions are found written in those scrolls according to their deeds, not their deeds committed in this life or before the scrolls were published, but their deeds afterward as long as they are on judgment. All through the judgment day of 1,000 years Jehovah's judge, Jesus Christ, can execute the sentence of destruction on any human proving himself incorrigible. But by this judgment day all men will have the opportunity to learn righteousness. Isaiah, chapter 26 verse 9, 2 Peter, chapter 3 verse 8, even if they prove obedient and learn righteousness during the 1,000-year judgment day of Christ, they will yet have to pass the final test of unswerving devotion to Jehovah's universal sovereignty after the 1,000 years are ended, at which time Satan and his demons will be loosed. Then they will stand without benefit of an intermediary before the one seated on the great white throne, hence on their own responsibility. If they pass this decisive test with faithful obedience to Jehovah God, the universal sovereign, first then will he as the supreme judge of all write their names in the scroll of life, thus authorizing them to enjoy perfect human life forever in the paradise earth. The footnote reads, "See Babylon the Great has fallen. God's kingdom rules." Pages 644 to 46. The more recent book Revelation, its grand climax at hand, page 296, similarly says of the survivors of Armageddon, their judging must continue through the 1,000 years as Jesus keeps on guiding them to fountains of waters of life. End of footnote. It seems incredible that any organization can rationalize such an imaginative reversal of matters, or how they can justify their assuming the right to adjust the good news of the first century, in effect rewriting the script so as to accommodate it to fit the doctrinal system they have developed. Certainly the International Proclamation, in which they replace the first century good news with their own 20th century version thereof, does not qualify as milling Jesus' prophecy about the preaching of the good news to all nations. When he said, "This good news of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world," he clearly referred to the good news as he presented it and as it was thereafter presented by his apostles and disciples, not some rewritten script of that good news to be found 1900 years later only in publications and magazines of a particular religious movement. That original good news, heard in the first century, remains the everlasting good news that needs no updating, and is the basis for the faith that was once for all time delivered to the holy ones. The footnote reads, Revelation, chapter 14 verse 6, Jude, verse 3. End of footnote. End of chapter 15.